Our first presentation is Dr. Vijay Rangarajan. So I'll request Dr. Vijay to come up and give us her presentation. Dr. Vijay, please.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, everybody. Sir, can you see my presentation?
Sure.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Good morning. I'll be presenting on novel approach to the management of severe facial disfigurement in neurofibromatosis type 1. I have nil financial disclosure. Orbitopalpebral neurofibromatosis is the most common form of benign peripheral nerve tumor. The palpebral will be deformed by peripheral systemic type neurofibromatosis type 1, or it can be a segmental orbitotemporal neurofibromatosis. This causes a shaped deformity of the upper lid ptosis and has a bag of worm appearance on palpation due to multiple neurofibromatous units with distinct peripheral sheath. Extensive upper lid neurofibromata creates a functional and aesthetic problem which is inadequately addressed in the literature. The levator action is also compromised, thus rehabilitation of the function along with aesthetic debulking is required. Surgical excision is usually complicated by excessive bleeding and poor post-op osmosis. Hence, repeated debulking is usually required. Aim of the study was to report a case series of 7 patients with orbitopalpebral neurofibromatosis. All patients presented with bulky upper lid causing mechanical ptosis with good to poor levator action and lateral canthal dystopia. Each patient was managed with customized surgical approach depending upon their clinical manifestation. All patients underwent a detailed systemic and ophthalmic evaluation like vision diffraction, anterior posterior segment examination like including squint, glaucoma, retina, ptosis, proptosis evaluation along with imaging. All patients were managed with a planned surgical approach. They underwent full thickness transverse resection of the upper lid neurofibroma along with canthopexy and ptosis correction depending upon the levator action. All patients were explained about the risk, benefit of the procedure and the need for additional surgical procedures if deemed necessary, and consent was taken. Case 1 was a 13-year-old female with drooping of the left upper lid since birth, gradually increasing in severity, and her best corrected vision was 6/6 in both eyes. She had a S-shaped ptosis with boggy soft swelling in the left upper lid with no levator function and temporal bony defect. The MRI brain showed a prominent tortuous venous channels in the left temple with intraorbital extension. She underwent lid reconstruction in a stage procedure. We did a left upper lid horizontal blepharotomy with canthal attachment of the upper and lower tarsal plates to the periosteum of the lateral orbital rim and levator reattachment. Second stage was done 1 month later with a frontalis sling and a lateral augmentation canthoplasty. Follow-up at 3 months and 4 years showed that she had a good cosmetic appearance, which was improved markedly and remained stable. And the second case was a 11-year-old male with a S-shaped ptosis and a boggy swelling of the left upper lid with a esotropia and hypotropia along with a raised IOP. The vision in the left eye was 1/60 and the levator function was 9 mm. CT brain showed a soft swelling in the left preseptal region, and he underwent a left full thickness transverse palpebral resection with a lateral canthopexy of the lower lid along with levator reinsertion of the tarsus. And the follow-up after 1 month showed that the results were very stable. And the third case was a 36-year-old man with neurofibromatosis type 1 with a left pulsatile proptosis, and vision in that eye was 6/18. Hertel showed 2 mm difference, 16 and 18. Levator action was 13. MRI brain showed left eye proptosis with mild herniation of the brain parenchyma through a defect in the lateral wall of the orbit. He also underwent radical palpebral resection like the previous 2 patients along with a levator reattachment. Follow-up, he maintained a good result with satisfactory cosmesis at 1 and 2 years of follow-up. And case 4 was a 24-year-old male with a swelling of the right upper lid with a poor marginal apposition for the past 2 years. Vision was 6/12, levator action was 13, and MRI brain showed a infiltrating soft tissue thickening along the lateral aspect of the right and upper lids and lateral canthus, and there was no postseptal extension. He underwent the same radical palpebral remodeling along with levator reattachment and canthoplasty. Follow-up at 1 year showed that patient had a good lid contour from this procedure. And case 5 was a 12-year-old female with a left severe ptosis and a lateral canthal displacement. The lid was overhanging and overlapping the lower lid with obliteration of the palpable aperture. Vision was 618, levator action was only 5. She underwent the first stage full thickness transverse oblique resection along with the lateral canthal attachment, and frontalis sling surgery was done 1 month later. But 5 years follow-up, she developed recurrent ptosis and repeat sling was done. 3 years later, there was a disease progression and she underwent repeat full thickness lid resection of the diseased upper lid and followed by frontalis sling at the same sitting. She maintained an unimpeded visual access and acceptable cosmesis at 6 months post-surgery. So case 6 was a female child who presented to us at first 1.5 years, where the left upper lid was heavily involved with a plexiform neurofibroma, hypoglobus and inophthalmos and facial asymmetry. And vision in that eye was 6/36, best corrected. MRI showed, brain showed a soft tissue swelling with a bony and lateral skull involvement. She underwent 3 surgeries of upper lid debulking at the age of 2 years, from the age of 2 years. At 11 years, she again presented a severe mechanical ptosis and oculopalpable diastasis, obscuring the visual axis. So she underwent a stage procedure with transverse blepharotomy, and after 3 months, a frontalis sling procedure with a lateral canthal tightening. And follow-up, she showed maintained an acceptable cosmesis and clear visual axis at 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year follow-up. 7th case was a 29-year-old male who had a left severe upper lid neurofibromatosis, which was operated twice in childhood. Vision was 6/18, and it was a distorted floppy upper lid with severe scarring, hypoplastic tarsus, and loss of lid globe apposition, no levator action. He underwent a similar procedure like what the other previous patients had undergone. But 3 months follow-up, he had a residual upper lid mass and underwent a full thickness transverse resection with again a pentagon wedge resection of the lateral portion of the 5 millimeter of the upper lid along with frontalis sling. He maintained a fairly satisfactory elevation of the upper lid at 6 months follow-up. So all 7 patients has different clinical manifestations, and the surgical approach depended on the extent of soft tissue, bony involvement, and visual potential. We reported a surgical technique which gave good functional and aesthetic benefit in spite of progressive and debilitating nature of the disease. Reconstructive eyelid surgery in a staged manner was planned with contralateral eyelid serving as a model. Patient underwent full thickness transverse palpable resection of the upper lid with lateral canthal attachment of both the tarsal plates to the periosteum. Ptosis correction was done depending on either LPS attachment or frontalis sling depending on the LPS function. Lee et al. Recommended partial excision.
Time is up.
And pasteurization could not suffice as there were chances of prolapse, and 2-stage procedure was better because that caused volume reduction as it preserved eyelid margin and post-op corneal this thing. And
Your time is up, Dr. Vijay.
Okay.
Just let her finish.
Okay. Surgical technique. Only 2 more slides. Surgical techniques, the contralateral upper lid was taken as a model. The contralateral eyelids width of the normal eyelid was measured, and supratarsal crease was marked. Distance between the supratarsal crease and normal eyelid was marked, and this formed the lower margin of interday excision. 3 dots were placed on the normal eyelid, medial, mid, and lateral, and the distance between these 2 areas was excised as a full thickness wedge. And the excised upper lid was reconstructed along with the lateral canthal attachment to the tarsal of the tarsal plate to the periosteum with lateral canthopexy. So plexiform infiltrator is very vascular and bleeds copiously during surgery. A tailored radical palpable resection can provide both functional and aesthetic benefit even in a patient, which improved patient social interaction and confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay. Nice presentation. Let me remind here all the presenters, there are marks for the time also.
Yes, that will deduct.
Yeah, if
yes,
you
that's all
the time, your marks would be deducted. So all subsequent presenter has to keep this thing in mind. So that's one aspect. Secondly, Dr. Vijay, very nice presentation. My one question is, do you have anything to add upon the standard line of treatment, or you are just presenting it as a series of cases? Because I think this is the standard treatment which is being offered. So anything new, or you just want to present the standard line of treatment?
Why I presented this, many times the patients are undergoing debulking, and it's mostly only a partial debulking done. Most of them are not doing the surgical repair because of the fear that the surgical correction will not be adequate or appropriate. So if we follow this technique, which was described by Muge et al. And Kobe, the cosmetic result as well as the functional outcome is quite satisfactory.
Okay. And your follow-up seems to be quite long in few of the cases. So what is the average follow-up in your cases?
Most of the patients have come, average is like 2 years, sir.
Okay, good. And the other thing
these
is...
patients, I have one question.
Yes, sir.
One question. Can you hear me, Vijay?
Yes, sir. I can hear you, sir.
These patients are notorious for recurrence. So what about recurrence? And some patients may develop malignancy, may not be early but late. So these two risks, one is recurrence and other is the malignancy. So what about those things in your patients?
Sir, when we counsel the patients, we told them that they may require a repeat surgery. They can have lifelong series of surgeries, and malignancy is one of the risk factors along with recurrence. This was counseled when before the surgery for all the patients. So they have to come for follow-up lifelong.
So are they mentally ready if they develop malignancy, maybe few cases, more maybe rare, but will they not go to the court against you? I mean, I have a real life question because you are doing a good surgery. I appreciate your surgery and really good surgery. Sir, but what about if some patients develop malignancy and you will be called to the court?
So we have actually got the consent form signed, and these patients mostly they are very much concerned about the lid deformity. So and also most of the patients were developing amblyopia. Out of 4 patients were amblyopic. So
Dr. Vijay, the time is up. I guess we need to proceed for the next speaker. Thank you so much.
That's why the surgery was done.
Anyway, just last question: where you perform these surgeries? Which institute?
Sir, Arvind Eye Hospital, sir, Coimbatore.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Nice presentation.
Hi, Subha. How are you?
Hi, sir. How are you?
How things are at Aurangabad?
Aurangabad
Nice.
was horrible, sir. Now it is decreasing. And we had a hell lot of cases of mucormycosis. Almost.
We also operated a good number of cases. More than 100 cases we operated at AIIMS, Raipur, of course, ENT, dental, and ophthalmology.
Dr. Mukesh, can we go for the next speaker, please?
Yeah, actually, we are having very packed session.
Yeah.
So our next presenter is Dr.
Please.
Salil Mandal. Dr. Salil, please.
I'm audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Please go ahead, Dr. Salil. Your time.
Okay. Start. My slide is visible?
Yes.
Great. Respected chairperson and my judges, my topic is 10 French silicone Foley's catheter use an expander device in lid reconstruction surgery. No partner and conflicts of interest to disclose. Removal of a large malignant tumor is always a challenge to the oculoplastic surgeon. The goal of the eyelid reconstruction maintains the anatomic integrity, physiologic function of the eyelid, and the restoration of vision and cosmesis. Conventional tissue expansions are expensive and may not be economical option for the patient in the developing world. Reconstruction and eyelid requires a minimum of 3 elements: outer layer of skin, inner layer of mucosa, and semi-rigid skeleton interposed between them. 10 French silicone Foley catheter is commercially available in the market and hospital ambulatory setting. And this procedure is there is a temporary expansion of the skin muscle soft tissue complex. This expanded tissue uses a tangential rotational flap. In 2019, we introduced a 10 French silicone Foley's catheter using an expander device. The basis is the skin stress relaxation of the base of the tissue expander. Once the force has been used to stretch the skin, a decreasing load is needed to maintain the stretch over time. CREEF refers to the increased rate of skin expansion with a constant load is applied over time. These are scientists, they applied the tissue expander, Malcolm 1985, Giver 1987, Jivixon 2005, and Alexander 2015. We start 2008-19 as an expander. Aim of the study to evaluate the efficacy of the 10 French silicone Foley catheter as a skin and soft tissue expander in repair of the upper and lower lid reconstruction, to evaluate the cost and safety of using silicone Foley catheter rather than a conventional silicone tissue expander to assess the anatomical, cosmetical, functional outcome that can so that it is to appraise the safety and efficacy of this method to compare other conventional method. Ethical committee approval was obtained. The prospective non-comparative interventional study of 30 patients over 18 months. All upper and low inclusion criteria, all upper and lower lid malignant tumor, lower lid, upper lid created different 40 to 70%. In exclusion criteria involve the local limb, distant metastasis, liver, lung, brain associated lower lid involvement, cause corneal infiltration. The results are lower lid created defect 58.5 plus standard deviation, upper lid clears 55.9 plus standard deviation. The mean Asian preoperative palpebral fissure height 4.8 to 9.6. Preoperative LPS action for upper lid tumors mean 5.5 to 13.7. Preoperative MRD1 value for upper lid 1 to 4.1 and post-operative after 6 months. The mean incision length with expander 70 with the standard deviation. Mean proposed incision length without expander 111. Cosmetically better look and rehabilitation much faster. Blink reflex is always represent all cases. There is no case of woundation. Follow-up period of 6 months to 1 year. So comes to a surgical procedure. This is an upper lid tumor, lower lid tumor. Pentagon incision is given. Proposed angular incision is marked. Proposed area of elliptical area of expansion is marked. Then single axis dissection over the long axis of the ellipse, over the periosteum. 10 French silicone Foley's catheter introduced and expanded 10 ml, the graded inflation of 10 ml of normal saline up to 6 days. On the 7th day, the day of operation, the catheter balloon deflated and tissue already relaxed. At that time, the same day, we excised the tumor with 4 meter wide margin apart from the and simultaneous tangible rotational flap. The curved convexity looks upward incision. Here, the tissue is already relaxed and easy to dissect and primary own closure without any suture line tension. This is a flap is created and suture line tension is minimum. This is a excellent anatomic cosmetic outcome after this surgery. This approach allows for tissue expansion temporarily, permitting the close of large eyelid defect, typically not possible in tendial flap, limiting vision to weeks that is in Curler-Beer procedure. Flap for easy rotation, minimal dragging force required to rotate the heavy flap for reconstruction. Suture line tension is reduced, incision is also reduced. Cosmetically much better, acceptable due to a decreased scar length and faster rehabilitation. Effectiveness and applicability of the tangible flap can be increased with the adjuvant use of time tissue expander. So comes to a conclusion, our study highlights the successful use of novel surgical approach of the eyelid reconstruction after tumor excision utilizing 10 French Foley catheter. Excellent function cosmetic outcome without closing the patient's eyelids. 10 French Foley catheter are both cost-effective, readily available in most hospital ambulatory setting. Further successful results of this noble ability makes it a reasonable, most cost-effective option in United States and other developing countries. Author believes that this makes it an excellent tissue expander in the developing world where the access to other more expensive expander are limited. This is my reference. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Mondal, for your good presentation. Now it is open for discussion. Dr. Sharma.
Yeah, Dr. Mandal, innovative concept. Did you measure your coloboma also like while reconstructing? Typically, what we say is that 40 to 60% colobomas can be repaired with Tangel's flap. So your defect was more than 60% of the lid. Like, did you measure that also? While
yes,
doing
yes,
this?
yes. In lower lid, we are doing at 60%, 60 to 70%. It is possible due to relaxation of the tissue. That is why we apply the expander. In normal tangible flap, it is up to 50 to 60%. It is possible. When you apply this expander, the tissue much more stretch. Then you can do reconstruction without a suture line tension. That is shown in the video. It is the tangible. It's conventionally done up to 60%, but we did 70% defect.
Okay.
Even we can try the more stretching. It can do a to at least 70 to 80% defect can be closer with the expansion of that temporal expansion of the soft tissue.
Mhm.
How
And
This is only possible. Yes.
Yes, Dr. Subha.
Yeah, one question is that patient goes home with this catheter.
No, 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 no. The patient, the first stage, the patient admitted in the hospital with
For
if
7
in the
days.
first stage it is no. In the first stage is expanded for 6 days.
Mhm.
A patient is admitted in the hospital. On the 7th day, catheter are deflated and we do surgery. After that, after 1 week, we do discharge the patient. Total stay of this hospital is 16 days, 15 days.
Mhm.
I have a question.
Yes.
Expanding this, whatever the skin for 6 days will delay your surgery and will be harmful for the staging of the tumor.
Yes, yes. This is our program is fixed, and our date of expansion and date of relaxation is also fixed. This is an experimental study. If you go more than expanded more than 15 days, 7 days, if it's 15 days, the swelling become fixed. That is why you should be planned before that. 6 days swelling, on the 7th day deflated, and you do the surgery.
Gentle
Whether
reminder,
it's-
Dr. Mandal, the time is up.
Yes.
Any
Thank you so much.
complication you have faced? Just last one.
Hello, yeah, question.
Any
Complication?
complication have you
No,
faced?
no. No augmentations, no infection, and no entropy and extension lesions. Still now, we do 30 patients about that, and the result is much more satisfactory than the conventional tangible flap.
Did you do this all in young patients?
Mostly in malignant tissue, but our series in malignancy is not expected in young ages. That is the advantage of this study. If it is young age, we can try it. In our study, the minimal age is more than 50. So there have an advantage of soft tissue relaxation also.
I appreciate
Thank
this.
you,
Thank you.
Jason.
I think somebody who's presenting for free papers 1640, they have a presentation in another hall. So the chairman may please decide what to do about it. 1640 paper. It's on the chat box.
Welcome, Dr. Ruchi.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Welcome, Dr. Ruchi. I think you have joined a little late. We were expecting you.
I was there,
nice
I
that you
was
have
quietly listening because the time was up, so I kept quiet.
So I think
I just asked Dr. Sharma that where is Dr.
No,
Goyal?
I've been listening, sir. I'm quite
Nice you were there.
just quiet because
1640 we can allow
Nice
the
having-
presentation if
Yeah.
they can join us within the stipulated time, like till 9:25. If they can join us, then we'll allow.
maybe we can prepone the talk if possible.
Sure, we can do that.
So maybe he can, after this talk, Dr. Shah, I think Dr. Gaurav Shah has written, maybe you can take that talk if it's okay.
Fine.
Okay, Dr. Gaurav?
Yes, we can take it.
Okay.
Okay, Dr. Mukesh, can we proceed, please? Thank
Yeah,
you.
so the next presenter is Dr. Stuti Tiwari. Dr. Stuti, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Stuti, yeah.
Yes, sir. So can I start?
Yeah,
Yes,
please go
please.
ahead.
Please.
Good morning to everyone. My topic for today is Adapting Through Change, the COVID-19 Lessons. I have no financial disclosure. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck our country in March 2020 and lockdown was imposed, there were no protocols for patient care during the COVID era. It was a challenge for the ophthalmologists as they worked in close proximity to the patients for examination and treatment, thus putting them at a higher risk for exposure. The risks specific to oculoplastic procedures are as follows. Aerosolizing procedures such as nasolacrimal syringing, dacryocysto-rhinostomy, orbital fracture repair, and orbital decompressions lead to sinuses and respiratory droplet formation, which can lead to further infection. Now, the viral transmission is also thought to occur through conjunctiva and tears. Procedures requiring general anesthesia and intubation place oculoplastic surgeons at a risk because of high aerosol generation. Therefore, I'll be talking about the clinic modifications and use of social media and telemedicine from March to May 2020 in our setup. The modifications of ophthalmic clinics are as follows. The first was behavioral control. Use of N95 masks, gloves, goggles, gowns, and face shields was done. Generous use of alcohol-based hand rub and hand washing was encouraged among the patients as well as the healthcare workers. Social distancing was maintained by asking the patients to sit on alternate seats in the waiting areas. Large protective plastic shields were installed on the slit lamp to prevent droplet infection. In addition to this, patients were asked to limit their speaking during the slit lamp examination. Under environmental control, disinfection of shields, tabletops, slit lamp, door handles, and chairs was done. The disinfectants used were diluted household bleach and alcohol solutions with at least 70% alcohol. In addition to this, maintenance of air ventilation in waiting areas was also ensured. The administrative measures taken were screening was done to identify patients with possible exposure to COVID-19. Procedures like nasolacrimal syringing and dicryocysto-rhinostomy were avoided, and all elective procedures with no life-threatening or sight-threatening concerns were postponed. Coming to the social media use, initially, triage of the patient was done via telephone, and non-urgent cases were asked to delay their visit. The patients were also given the option to send a preliminary photograph of their lesion and all other relevant documentation prior to the consultation via email. Virtual meetings continued through Google Meet, and interdepartmental consultations were done using online applications. Smartphones with high-resolution cameras made photo documentation of the patient as well as the lesion easier. Social media and widespread 4G data network made teleconsultation feasible. In the use of telemedicine, initially it was used for aesthetic consultations and follow-up appointments in post-op cases like entropion, ectropion, and eyelid tumors. Later on, it was also used for inpatient triaging and preliminary evaluation of skin lesions which were thought to be malignant, and also in triaging of the patient presenting with proptosis. Decision regarding whether the patient required an in-person visit to the clinic was taken via telemedicine. The younger generation, being familiar with new technology, was more comfortable with telemedicine. Also, the current work environment has advanced technology, video-equipped computers, and cell phone cameras, which makes telemedicine easier. Now, there are certain drawbacks to telemedicine. One of them is that it doesn't address complex diagnoses such as orbital tumors or orbital trauma. One of the important challenges that remain is that online payment methods are still not addressed. New legislature and state laws are needed to address the issues of liability and coverage. Hence, we can conclude that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the interface of doctor-patient interaction. And even though measures were taken to keep things as close to normal as possible while following the protocol, the new normal, that is modifications of ophthalmic clinics, telemedicine, and social media had to be adapted to for evaluation and treatment of patients with oculoplastic disorders in our setup. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stuti. That was a nice presentation. Obviously, you all had to go through all these challenges which you have nicely described and categorized into different behaviors here.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. So have you done any comparative study with other centers or something like that?
With other centers, no, ma'am.
Okay.
I have another question, Dr. Stuti.
Yes, sir.
This is all standard. Like, do you have anything other than the standard to offer in your study? Like any extra thing which generally people are not offering? Like.
No, sir. Actually, it was done during that period when there was the first wave of COVID-19, and we had just started with the COVID era. So the studies of that time
Okay.
during
Have you
March to
developed-
May 2020.
Have you developed any special consent for patients who are given telemedicine? Or
So for patients who join us through telemedicine, we give them the standard consent that few problems or diagnosis may be missed because we are not actually examining the patient in person. So palpation of masses or exact
so you
evaluation
need
is
to
not.
devise an special consent form, though it is believed now if a patient has approached a doctor on WhatsApp or any media which is recordable, then
Yes, sir.
even consent is not mandatory. But
Yes.
for the all obvious reasons, we need to have a special consent, and patient has to accept that before going ahead with telemedicine. Okay.
Any
But what is new about it, Stuti? Everybody is doing something. Dr. Stuti,
Yes, sir.
can you anything new? It means the whole country, everybody is doing same thing.
Yes, actually it's the standard protocol, but it was new, sir, at that time when we had done the study and I had submitted the abstract at that time during the March to May 2020.
Maybe you could
You have
have
told
compared
some
with
things.
different specialities, the whole protocol, maybe that would have been more significant rather than basically you have just what these are the standard operating protocols that you've mentioned. Anyway, I think we can go to the next talk. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, while the next talk is being uploaded, there have been studies which have shown like increased number of chances of COVID-19 infections with the refractive error spectacle frame which we use. And there have been multiple studies in ophthalmology point of view also. So Dr. Stuti, you could have done some comparative behavioral changes, like the centers who strictly follow COVID-19 positive protective protocols have less number of COVID-19 transmission cases. Something like this would have actually been more fruitful and positive.
Before we proceed, let me tell you, we have only 55 minutes remaining for this session, and we have 7 speakers more to go.
So
Please
please
go
take
ahead.
1640 now.
Yes, ma'am. A very good morning to one and all. So today I'll be presenting on the clinical pathological features and management of advanced iron orbital plasmacytoma. I have no financial interest to disclose. Expect the best, plan for the worst, and prepare to be surprised. Orbit being a Pandora's box, I'm sure all of you agree with the above statement. Plasmacytomas constitute 5 to 10% of all plasma cell neoplasms and only 1% of the orbital tumors. Orbital plasmacytoma is an uncommon presentation of multiple myeloma. In more than half of the cases, it is only discovered after the diagnosis of multiple myeloma. We aim to study the clinical pathological features and management of advanced iron orbital plasmacytoma. This was a retrospective observation and intervention case series in 6 patients from 2013 to 2019. I'm going to present 2 cases in detail. This is a 20-year-old male presented with a painful gradually progressive swelling of the right lower eyelid since 30 days. On examination, there was 3 mm of hyperglobus with temporal fossa fullness and ecchymosis. And on palpation, there was a mildly tender mass in the inferior temporal orbit. There is a chemosis of the tarsal conjunctiva seen on slit lamp. On CT scan, there is a well-defined heterodense mass centered in the zygoma with orbital and temporal fossa extension with specks of calcification with bony erosion. Coming to my second case, this is a 70-year-old elderly male who presented to us with a complaint of swelling in the left upper eyelid since 3 months, which was painless and gradually progressive. On examination, the anterior segment was normal. There was an hypoglobus of 2 millimeters, proptosis of 5 millimeters. The extraocular movements were limited in all the gazes except inferiorly, and the patient had diplopia in all the gazes. We went ahead with MRI, which showed well-defined soft tissue mass in superolateral aspect of the left orbit, which was iso-intense on T1 and T2, causing destruction of the adjoining left frontal lobe in the roof of left orbit with intracranial extension in the left frontal lobe. The CT scan confirmed the destruction of the roof and the lateral walls, causing compression of the superior surface of the left lobe and abutting the superior rectus. So these are the rest of our cases presenting similarly with the swelling of the lower eyelid, proptosis, and the CT scan showing the orbital mass with destruction of the orbital bones. So this is a brief summary of all our cases, and the mean age of presentation was 55 years, and male to female ratio was 2:1, and most commonly it was unilateral presentation. And the patients presented with swelling of the lower lid, proptosis, and diplopia, and the mean duration of symptoms was 27 days. Multi-level incision biopsy was done in all the patients, and the light microscopy shows diffusely distributed plasma cells and plasmablasts. Immunohistochemistry was positive for CD138 in all these cases. The diffusely seen kappa chain was seen in a few cases associated with multiple myeloma. Once we have the diagnosis, systemic evaluation is very important to rule out multiple myeloma, including bone marrow biopsy and PET-CT scan. 3 of our patients had associated multiple myeloma. Coming to the management options, radical radiotherapy has an excellent local disease control. In this particular study, the relapse rate with radiotherapy alone were comparatively less compared to surgery or chemotherapy. There are very limited literature with few case reports on systemic chemotherapy in these patients. Autologous stem cell transplantation was reserved for many multiple or recurrent lesions. External beam radiotherapy was given in 4 of our patients to the orbit and the cranium accordingly. Systemic chemotherapy and bone marrow transplant was given in 1 patient. 1 patient denied further in evaluation and treatment. Coming to the treatment response, 1 patient showed excellent response, and 1 patient had a good response, and 2 patients had partial, and 1 patient succumbed to the disease with the postponement of treatment with a delay of 4 weeks, and he succumbed to multi-organ failure. With a mean follow-up of 3.4 years, 5 of our patients are doing well with good visual activity. So International Myeloma Working Group have designed a criteria for monoclonal gammopathies, multiple myeloma, and related disorders in 2003. Plasmacytoma can broadly be classified as systemic disease and localized disease. The localized disease can further be classified into solitary plasmacytoma of the bone, where there is a single bone lesion, solitary extramedullary plasmacytoma, where there is single soft tissue lesion, and multiple solitary plasmacytoma, where there are multiple sites of disease in the bone or soft tissue or both. There are a few factors responsible for rapid conversion of plasmacytoma to multiple myeloma, and it is very important to look and evaluate for all of these conditions. To conclude, although plasmacytoma of orbit is rare, ophthalmologists should be familiar with it. It is important to consider the diagnosis of plasmacytoma in a patient with bony orbital mass irrespective of the age group. Systemic workup for multiple myeloma is very essential to guide the treatment and to prognosticate the disease. Detailed histopathological evaluation with immunohistochemistry is important. The role of imaging should be focused on early detection of additional recurrent lesions, which influence the clinical management, and aggressive and early initiation of multimodal treatment is warranted. These are my references. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Harita, for finishing in time.
Thank you, sir.
I'll request other people to ask the questions.
Yeah. Doctor, I have one question to ask. This is a very nice study actually. It's not so common disease. So, were you able to establish few of the clinching clinico-radiological feature of plasmacytoma? Diagnostic clinico-radiological feature?
Yes, sir. Clinically, first, it is mostly a lesion, although we did not see any restriction to the limitation to the age group, because youngest in our case series is 20 years. So irrespective of the age group, once we have a triradiate, palpable lesion with the bony destruction on palpation, and radiologically also if we have a triradiate lesion, then plasmacytoma is one of the important differential diagnoses we have to keep in mind. And in younger patients, although infection and inflammation have to be ruled out, but again in elderly patients, we need to keep in mind adenocarcinoma of the lacrimal gland or any other lymphomas, and the metastasis to the orbit are important differentials along with this plasmacytoma in triradiate lesions.
It's a very good question by Dr. Sharma, because every patient we have to wait for the confirmation from biopsy. Without that, if you have mentioned that yes, if there is some radiological features, there is any clinically relevant question by Dr. Sharma. Any other question, Ruchi, Shubha?
Yeah, 5 years is actually usually when you see the survival rates, it's usually 5 years at least the minimum follow-up. So isn't it a little too premature to predict what was the survival rate with, I think 3.4 years you said?
Follow-up at 3.4 years, ma'am. But again, till now the patients were doing well. We have been following them every 6 monthly till annual 6 monthly for 3 years till now, and then we will follow the patients annually. And yeah, so if after at least 2 years of another follow-up, we can generalize this.
So you're getting a PET scan then? How do you like what investigations do you?
CT scan we are getting it annually, ma'am. And in between clinically, we are monitoring the patient. And there, if we have any suspicion clinically, then we will go ahead with the PET CT scan at that moment. Otherwise, if everything clinically is fine, then we'll go ahead for annual PET CT scans.
I think we can go to the next talk.
Yes, with the next.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Dr. Atul Kamath, is he here?
Okay.
I'm Dr. Durin. Presenting author is Dr. Durin.
Dr.
Durin.
Darren.
This hall coordinator, you should have numbered these presentations. Otherwise, it is so confusing. You should have numbered. Next time, onwards, make it numbered according from the first to last numbered. So that it is easier.
Dr. Mukesh, why? Yeah, the next number is Dr. Darren.
Okay, fine.
Which one is coming? Can you number it?
Yeah,
Just-
Dr. Darren, okay, fine. Dr.
Okay,
Darren.
just give me 1 minute, sir. I'll make an announcement quickly.
Is the fourth
Next
one-
two, I'll make an announcement. Is it okay? Next is Dr. Somi Purohit, and next Dr. Priyadarshini Nanda. Next two speakers.
Okay, fine.
So who is the next speaker right now?
Dr. Darren is right now. After Dr. Darren, Dr. Somi Purohit and Dr. Priyadarshini Nanda.
So now we are going
So,
into
Dr. Darren, you can start, I guess.
Good morning, one and all. I am presenting on the topic is DCR a possible option in post-DCT patients with bothersome tearing. There is no financial disclosure. So as we all know, Dr. Woolhouse is the person who first described dactyocystectomy, which is mainly described as a novel procedure for chronic dactyocystitis. But currently, malignant tumors of lacrimal sac, in that cases only we are doing dactyocystectomy in a case of chronic dactyocystitis. But as a sad truth, it is still in practice for chronic dactyocystitis in developing countries like India, which leaves patients teary-eyed. So do you think is DCT the end of the road? So here we come up with our study to evaluate the outcome and efficacy of a modified technique called canaliculodactyocystorhinostomy in the complete absence of lacrimal sac as a mean to re-establish the lacrimal drainage in post-dactyocystectomy patients. So this is a prospective interventional study in 15 proved and established post-DCT patients who have been operated elsewhere for primary acquired nasolacrimal duct obstruction, who presented into our clinic with bothersome tearing. All patients were underwent ocular examination along with thorough lacrimal workup. Point of block was determined by measuring the common canaliculi length. So let me start with my procedure. So appropriate skin incision was placed, followed by retraction of the residual periosteum, and lacrimal fossa was entered. Adequately bony-sized ostium was created by enlarging the previous ostium. So afterwards, large-sized anterior nasal flap was fashioned. Then we inserted the Bowman's probe into the common canaliculi and tended the common canaliculi area, and sharp dissection was carried out at the area over the tended probe. Internal membranectomy was done, followed by application of cotton tip dipped in 0.2 milligram per ml of mitomycin C, which was placed between the new canalicular opening and nasal mucosa for 3 minutes to prevent the further fibrosis. Later on, bicanalicular silicone intubation was performed and the tube was secured inside the nasal cavity with a single square knot. Nasal mucosal flap was sutured to the tissues above the created common canalicular opening and secured by broad bight of orbicularis fibers. Later on, patency was checked immediately after the surgery, and silicone tube was left in place for 12 weeks. Every patient was initially followed up weekly for 1 month, later on monthly for 6 months, and during each visit, patency was confirmed. So coming to results, we studied around 15 patients, and after 6 months, all 14 patients maintained patency. Major complication we came across was tube prolapse, which we repositioned it as an office procedure. The other common complication which we came across was prominent scar, and one was loss of patency. Our success rate is 93.3%. As we all know, DCT is a procedure for primary acquired nasolacrimal duct obstruction with no comorbidities. It is rather unfortunate. Due to secondary distal or common canalicular block, these patients will come to you with epiphora. As in literature, Dowsett and Horwitz described a similar kind of procedure, but in their procedure, they created an anterior and posterior canalicular flap and sutured the nasal mucosal flap into it. Lee J.H. et al. Also performed a similar kind of surgery, but details were not given in the literature. So we came up with a simple procedure. In this, we sutured the nasal mucosal flap and anchored it directly into the remnants of orbicularis in line with the common canalicular opening. Here we didn't create any canalicular flaps. So with this procedure, we were able to re-establish the lacrimal drainage in most of our patients. Limitation of our study was small sample size, lack of long-term follow-up, and it requires minimum of 7 millimeter long canaliculus. So I conclude that this modified canalicular DCR is a simple method in post-DCT patients. It is safe and effective. So I think post-DCT is not the end of the road. Thank you.
Well, nice presentation, Dr. Darren.
Thank you,
I
sir.
have one question to ask. What was the time interval between DCT and your surgery, mean time interval? One. And secondly, there can be two subset of patient post DCT. One where there is pseudo-sac formation. In many of the patient after DCT, we get pseudo-sac formation. And second, those group of patient where there is no pseudo-sac formation. So did you identify your patient according to these two sets?
Yes, sir. In most of the patients came with bothersome tearing. So when we did probing, as we established that there is a soft stop, and then during surgery, whatever sac remnants were there, we removed it, and then we did the surgery. During the surgery, we dissected out whatever the sac remnants were there. Then we continued with our surgery, sir.
And what was the time interval between DCT and your surgery, average time interval?
1 year, sir.
And what about the patients, those who had after dissection, you find a lot of extensive fibrosis at the sac area, which has been removed, extensive fibrosis, will you go ahead with this surgery or leave those patients?
No, sir.
Extensive fibrosis.
If there was extensive fibrosis, we couldn't, we won't be able to.
Gain fibrosis.
Hello, sir. If the patient is having extensive fibrosis, then it will be little difficult, sir. But still, we managed to do the surgery, sir. We did a sharp dissection and followed by application of MMC and intubating with the silicone tube. We were able to maintain the patency, sir. We were able to follow up the patient for 6 months.
Gentle reminder, time is up. Thank you so much.
What is the success rate of your patients? Just one.
Among 50, sir, success rate is around 94%, sir. Like 15 patients we have done. In that, all 14 patients are absolutely normal, sir. Like there is no tearing afterwards. One patient was symptomatically better, but anatomically he was still having little bit of regurgitation, sir.
Okay, thank you. I think time is up.
Dr. Mukesh, Before you go ahead, let me remind everyone that we have 7 more speakers and we have only 35 minutes. We're very tight on time. One more request. One more request. Let me announce the next 3 speakers. Please be ready. Next is Dr. Somi Purohit. Then we have Dr. Priyadarshini Nanda, and then we have Dr. Ritija Thomas. Please be ready. Thank you.
Mr. Sanjay, I have something to say, Dr. Shilpa.
Yes, please.
Dr. Ritija, who's third from now, she has a talk at 9:30 in another.
Sanjay, you do not tell all the speakers, just tell the next speaker.
Sure, sir. Sure.
So if we can take Dr. Ritija after Dr. Somi, as in second from now.
Dr. Shilpa, you are moderator. You can take a call. It's okay. You can take a call. No problem.
Is it okay with the chairman and the?
Sure.
Yes, you the speaker. That's all, because I'm not following the
You're fine. So Dr. Somi would be presenting now, and she is
please
a non-ratified member. So I guess we need not to mark this paper.
Sir, I am a member, sir.
It's mentioned in our marks here that you are a non-ratified member. What is your membership number?
Sir, my membership number is S24123.
Okay, so it is non-ratified. You must have become member now only, no? Within
1 year back, I
this will be ratified in President GB. Dr. Sharma, this will be ratified in President GB. I saw the numbers. I think she will be ratified this President GB.
All right, so we shall mark her and leave the decision to the chairman scientific committee. We'll mark her. Okay, fine.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, shall I please share screen?
Anyway, I am not going to mark her because it is written there that non-ratified committee. I think we will not mark her because I checked the number. This number is not ratified.
Not ratified, yeah. Her number is not ratified.
Anyway, you present it. That's nice.
Yes, sir. Never mind,
You
sir.
come to
But
present
we
us.
will not be presented. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Sir, are my slides visible, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, good morning, respected judges. I'm going to present my paper on a 2-year prospective clinico-microbiological study of orbital infections in a tertiary care unit. Paper number 193. Our study the aim was to study the clinico-microbiological profile of orbital infections. This study focuses on prompt identification of clinical signs and symptoms of orbital infection and microbiological study. We classified our patients of orbital infection into 2 broad classifications, preseptal and postseptal, based on the Monoli's modification of Chandler's classification. If it was anterior to the orbital septum, it was preseptal or periorbital infection, and if it was posterior, it was postseptal or orbital cellulitis. Now, why is orbital cellulitis more dangerous? Because it affects the structures behind the orbital septum. There is always a threat of extension from periorbital structures like paranasal sinus, phase, eyelid infection, dactylitis, dental infection, etc. Early clinical distinction is very vital amongst orbital infection. The causes can be exogenous and endogenous. Exogenous causes being trauma and surgery, and endogenous causes being bacteremia with septic emboli, intraorbital causes like endophthalmitis, etc. Now, orbital infections can have life-threatening complications like septicemia, endophthalmitis, and cavernous sinus thrombosis. After taking ethical committee clearance and proper consent from our patients, we started our study in the Department of Ophthalmology, Vimsar, Burla, in the year June 2018, which carried up to May 2020. Please note, at this time, the COVID was just on its start. And our sample size was 147. It was a prospective study. We included all the patients with orbital infection of all age group, and we excluded the patients with masquerading tumors. The variables were age in years, etiology of the infection along with underlying comorbidities, clinical profile was signs and symptoms, microbiological evaluation of samples. The samples that were taken were the aspirate from the site, the sinus aspirations, and blood samples. And our studies were history taking, microevaluation, CT scan, MRI, and neuroconsultation if necessary. Now, the results that we found was that more than 80% of our cases were preseptal and less than 20% were orbital cellulitis. The maximum number of cases were present in the age group 0 to 15 years, which was 54 cases. And then we had another peak at 41 to 60 year age group, and hence we have this bimodal peak here. Please note that. And in the predisposing factor, sinusitis was our most common predisposing factor. In preseptal cellulitis, we had maximum of sinusitis, and in orbital cellulitis, the rare cases which we found was one case of post-COVID mucor, diabetes mellitus mucor, and diabetes mellitus, along with a cavernous sinus thrombosis. Now, the samples with positive culture which we found was in 53 cases of sinus irrigation, we found that 33 patients had positive culture for infection. Out of 28 patients of orbital aspirate, we had 17 positive, and out of 147 blood samples, we had 25 blood sample culture positive. Now, the organisms which were isolated, the maximum number where we found in the patients was of Staphylococcus aureus, followed by Streptococcus pyogenes, and in the 2 mucor cases, our fungus was Rhizopus. Now, when we compared our study with the other studies, we found that the preseptal cellulitis was maximum in our study, which was 80, and in the study done by Dennis in 2017, they also had maximum of preseptal cellulitis. We found a bimodal peak, which was also comparable to Pandian et al. In 2011 and Chang et al. In 2017, which found the bimodal peak. The predisposing factors, as we said, the sinusitis we found was most common, and it was also found by Sarah et al. And Staphylococcus aureus infection was maximum in our case, whereas Mohammed et al. Also found in 2020 that we had maximum Staph aureus. Now, these were our patients. This is of bilateral orbital cellulitis, preseptal cellulitis of the right eye, mucormycosis of the left eye, and this is a plate showing the beta hemolysis by Staphylococcus aureus. So I would conclude my study by saying that we found preseptal cellulitis is more common than orbital. OI has maximum bipodal. Orbital infections have a bimodal peak. Sinusitis followed by trauma was the most common predisposing factor, and the comorbidities like diabetes mellitus can lead to severe form of orbital cellulitis. Staphylococcus aureus followed by Streptococcus pyogenes are the common organisms found in the samples, and very importantly, a thorough clinical evaluation combined with diagnostic microbiological expertise would help curb maximum complications in orbital infection. We do not have any financial interest, no sponsorship, no conflict of interest, and these are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Somi, for a nice presentation and also concluding on time.
Thank you, sir.
One question or rather comment.
Yes, sir.
In your preseptal cellulitis cases, sinusitis was the most common association, I guess.
Sir.
Generally, sinusitis lead to orbital cellulitis because sinus opening or sinus proximity is behind the septa.
Yes, sir.
Ethmoid sinus also is proximal to the orbital area, which is behind septa. So whenever there is cellulitis secondary to sinusitis, we get orbital cellulitis rather than preseptal cellulitis. Preseptal cellulitis is mostly related to trauma and other minor.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So that's just an observation.
Cases. Actually, we did the cases which we had. I included it, all of them.
Okay.
So anyways, sir. Yeah. Any other questions?
Anything new? This like everybody knows the Staphylococcus and Streptococcus pyogenes.
So actually, the new thing that we found was actually COVID.
And of course, the observation of Dr. Sharma is very right.
Yeah, sir. Actually, the new thing, actually, by our study, we wanted to find the orbital cellulitis and preseptal cellulitis cases present in Odisha as such, because there were no study done before. And secondly, so the new thing that we found was mucormycosis, because it was done in May to 2020 only. So we found one case of mucormycosis, but of course the number of mucormycosis cases have, of course, they have increased by 19 in our institute, which is the second highest in Odisha presently after AIIMS Bhubaneswar. So I couldn't include that in my talk. Hence, that's it, sir.
All right.
You got mucormycosis that long back, because quite long back I have studied.
So that was,
I think what we are seeing mucormycosis recently in last few months.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We had
I think your presentation, you have submitted your paper long back.
Yes, sir. That's what I'm saying, sir. We had one case at that time, and that's why I wanted to include it here.
Okay, so I think we move ahead now for the next presentation. Dr. Rituja.
Next.
Yeah.
Good morning to all the chairpersons, the moderators. Thank you for having me. So today I'll be talking about a bespoke algorithm for the reconstruction of contracted sockets. So we all know what a contracted socket is and what it entails. basically there is some loss of pharyngeal space, volume, surface, which sort of leads to the inability to retain a prosthesis. However, the classical grading which has been present until now, the classical Gopal Krishna classification, quantifies only the pharyngesis. So we decided to come up with some algorithm which can sort of unify all the conditions associated with a contracted socket and possibly decide how to manage a contracted socket better. So the aim of our study was to compare the predictive ability of the Gopal Krishna grade 1 to 5 classification versus our bespoke algorithm in the outcome of contracted socket management. So we conducted a retrospective study on our group of 47 patients who underwent socket reconstruction. So our anatomic factor classification, we called it FSV. This is based on shallow pharyngesis, a surface deficit, and a volume deficit. So inadvertently, whenever we see these factors, we tend to use them while planning surgery. But until now, there is no gross algorithm yet in place to manage them well. So when there is a shallow fornix, we do fornix deepening sutures. When there is a surface deficit, we do mucous membrane grafting. When there's a volume deficit, we can do a secondary implant. And when there are combined defects, we do a dermis fat graft. So we decided to check the outcome measures as the retention of prosthesis or the need for a repeat surgery. So we had nearly twice the number of males as females. The causes for socket contraction were surgery, trauma, chemical injury, and congenital. So as per the conventional classification, this was the grading. The maximum number of patients were in grade 2 and 3. And in the results, the indication for surgery was not retaining prosthesis, a small prosthesis, and a tilting prosthesis. Now, based on our anatomic factors, when we classified the patients, all the patients had a shallow fornix. So all of them underwent surgery for that. And 60% had a volume deficit and 40% had a surface deficit. So isolated FDS or fornix deepening suture was done for patients who had shallow fornix. In addition to that, when there was a surface deficit, a mucous membrane graft was performed. If there was a volume deficit with fornix, then a secondary implant in FDS. And if all three, a dermis fat graft and FDS. The mean follow-up was around 18 months. So in the post-surgery events, most of them did well. Some had a granuloma, others skin excoriation, infection, and 8 of them needed repeat surgery. In the surgical outcome, 4 of the patients had a tilted prosthesis or not retained prosthesis, which we took as a bad outcome. So this is an example of a patient with one factor. So fornix forming sutures were done for the fornix, shallow fornix. This is 2 factors. So there was a shallow fornix and a volume deficit. So a secondary implant and fornix formation was done, after which the patient retained the prosthesis well. And in this, there was a fornix surface and volume deficit, for which a fornix forming suture and a dermis fat graft was done, after which the patient was able to put in a prosthesis. So in the results, the repeat surgery as such didn't show any pattern, because either we didn't have enough numbers or there was some sort of bias towards using the anatomic classification. But with respect to the bad outcomes, the conventional classification did not predict the bad outcome well, wherein higher grades of contracted socket were showing a less of a bad outcome. Whereas in ours, patients who had more than 3 factors from the anatomic classification had a bad outcome, 21% versus 3%. So to conclude, with a good planning, the FSV, that is fornix, surface, and volume classification, even worse sockets get a good result as a better socket with surgery. Almost 90% of the patients were able to retain a well-fitted prosthesis using the FSV algorithm. Our bespoke algorithm helps to predict a poor outcome with respect to the number of anatomic factors as compared to the conventional method. And with respect to the repeat surgeries, further studies are needed to quantify the difference. So what we know already is that pharyngeal shallowing is not the only factor which correlates with surgical outcome. What we added is surface deficit and volume deficit. And we need future studies to quantify it better. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rituja, for a nice presentation and good paper. One question: why are you calling it bespoke classification?
Because till now there are only case reports or sort of studies which are done in patients wherein they found one factor and then decided to work on that. For example, surface, they would probably do an AMG or an MMG and then work on it. But until now, there isn't a proper classification with a large number of patients to sort of, decide exactly what to do. Because till now, people are only saying, oh, they have 2 shallow pharynxes or 3 shallow pharynxes, 4 shallow pharynxes. So until now, there is no unified classification on how to go about these cases in a standardized manner.
And the other thing is that your 3 grades are fine, but I think there is an importance of 1 pharynx shallow or 2 shallow pharynx on the management itself, because if only there is shallowing of lower pharynx as it is there in standard grading, then we can do directly the pharynx formation. If there are more than 1 pharynx which are shallow, then we may have to resort to MMG. So it does have some implication on the management part. So it would have been, I think, better if you would have sub-classified your FSV. Then I think it would have made more management orientation clear. But even then, it is nice attempt.
Yeah. In future, that
you have mentioned about the volume deficit, right?
Yes. Yes.
So what about that in your study?
So deficit with a shallow pharynx, they underwent a secondary implant. And those who had surface deficit along with volume deficit with a shallow pharynx, they underwent a dermis fat graft, which would account for the surface creation as well as to augment the volume, sir.
Anybody, any question?
So I think
Dr. Ruchi, Dr. Suva.
I think we can go to the next talk. It's a nice presentation. I think the concept was always there in our minds, and you have just brought it into, and we really need to get a new classification. I agree with you totally.
Thank you, ma'am.
So calling Dr. Priyadarshini Nanda next. Are you ready, Dr. Priyadarshini?
Yes, ma'am.
Please start.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Hello.
Share your screen.
Please start.
Yes, sir. Hello, this is Dr. Good. Hello. Is my screen visible?
Yes, doctor. Yes, it's visible.
No, screen is not visible anyway.
Is it visible now?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. Hello, good morning to one and all. This is Dr. Priyadarshini Nanda. My topic is suprabrow single step versus 3-step incision frontally sling surgery in congenital ptosis. Pre-paper number 1298. So disclosing the authors, we don't have any financial conflict of interest, no financial interest, and I thank the IOS for giving me the opportunity. Ptosis is defined as abnormally low position of upper eyelid. Ptosis is of 2 types, congenital and acquired. Simple congenital ptosis is most common variant in children and young adults. Its probable cause is failure of neuronal migration or development of LPS with muscular sequelae. Prevalence is 62 to 88% amongst all types of ptosis. And 92% cases we have unilateral, while 8% are bilateral. The diagnosis is made on history indicating its presence from birth, which can be confirmed by old photographs. And on examination, we find drooping of upper eyelid, absence of upper lid crease, and moderate to poor levator function. Ptosis gives rise to 2 major problems. The most common of being cosmetic, and the second is amblyopia. Serious one being the stimulus deprivation amblyopia, which usually affects children with unilateral and severe ptosis. Early treatment of severe ptosis is indicated in the preschool age children as there is threat for stimulation, deprivation, amblyopia. Coming to management of simple congenital ptosis, it is mainly surgical, and the choice of the procedure depends on the degree of ptosis and levator function. Usually, congenital ptosis tend to occur with a poor levator function, and in majority of cases, frontalis muscle has to be included in the muscle system to potentiate the elevation of lid. The tarsus of the upper lid is attached to the frontalis muscle by means of a sling, which can be obtained from various autologous and synthetic sources. And the common surgery for congenital ptosis with poor levator function is frontalis sling surgery, and the commonest technique is Fox Spectrum or Suprabrow single step technique. My purpose of the study is to compare suprabrow single step with the 3-step frontalis sling conventional surgery to look for the cosmetic and functional outcome. This was a 2-year study which started from November 2018 and till the October 20 of 2020. Study design was prospective and a comparative study. Materials and material reviews. All the patients who reported to our OPD with having simple congenital ptosis with poor levator function were included in the study, and it comprised of 68 cases. Inclusion criteria: all the patients who noticed ptosis since birth were included in the study. Congenital, ocular, and systemic anomalies associated with ptosis patient. Exclusion criteria was post-traumatic or post-inflammatory, post-surgical, aponeurotic, or mechanical pseudotosis and other acquired causes ptosis. Preoperative comprehensive ocular examination was done with respect to best corrector visual acuity. Slit lamp biomicroscopy was done. Bell's curve was excluded. Corneal sensation, Summers test was done. Marcus Gunn jaw winking phenomenon and ocular alignment and extraocular muscle movement was seen. Outcomes parameter were preoperatively we look for the palpebral fissure height, the marginal reflex distance, levator function, vertical fissure height, and postoperatively we check for the lid edema, scarring, pain, discomfort, vertical fissure height, MRD1, lag ophthalmos, and lid closure. Our results are as following. When compared with the mean reflex distance, marginal reflex distance 1 between the two procedures, we found that the p-value was non-significant preoperatively for both of the cases, but postoperatively highly significant result was shown in the SBSS group. In levator function comparison between the two techniques, the value between the both showed a similar function, a similar value, so the p-value was non-significant. Vertical fissure height in the second group, which was single brow technique, the p-value was highly significant in all of the follow-ups. Lag optimal score was better again in the SBSS group with respect to the 3SFS group. A lid crease comparison between 3SF and SBSS, the p-value was significant. The highly significant value was seen in the subsequent 7 days, 3 months, and 6 months in the SBSS group. So post-operatively day 3, post-operative day 3rd month showed that marginal reflex distance in 1 was SBSS was significantly higher, and the VSS when compared also was better in the SBSS group. Again, lag score was found to be better in the 3-step frontalis sling group in the 7th day, thereby suggesting the 3 frontalis sling technique gave better outcome with improvement in lag optimal score, thus maintaining good cosmetic score. Lid crease showed significant improvement in single brow, suprabrow single step in comparison to 3-step frontalis in the day 1, 7, and 3 months, and 6 months, thus giving us good cosmetic score. So to conclude, suprabrow single step incision technique is a promising modification of conventional 3-step technique for congenital ptosis. It gives a quick learning curve, superior cosmetic result, and reduced operating time. These are my references. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Priyadarshini. It was a nice presentation, but this single step incision surgery was attempted earlier on also, and the main concern is of contour, and you have not included contour assessment in your parameters. So I think your whole study is not very conclusive, because there has to be something related to contour in your assessment post-operatively, but that was not there. So a localized
So we-
lift would be there in single brows also, but a good contour of lateral and medial part is somewhat lacking. So I think that part was missing.
Yes.
In fact, if you could have proved that the contour is better in comparison to single incision, then we could have missed this work would have been accepted as a better work or new thing. Otherwise, if you do not mention the contour, which Dr. Sharma has rightly told, what is the meaning of this work?
Yes, sir. So we mostly saw look for the post-operative scar and edema functional outcomes. What we look mostly for, and it gave a proper cosmetical results when we compared between the scars of the two.
So
Within the
cosmetic means that's the contour of the lead. Anyway, any other question from?
Dr. Mukesh, we have only 9 minutes left for this session.
So next presenter is Dr. Neha Arora. Is she here?
I think we will not mark this as per the seat. This girl is not a ratified member.
Okay. So next presenter is Dr. Neha Arora, FP 1722.
Yes.
Are you here?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Sir, my screen is visible and am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening, good morning, everyone. My talk is on association of hemifacial spasm and blepharospasm with facial nerve. I have no financial disclosures. The objective of my study is to study the association of hemifacial spasm and blepharospasm with proximal and distal vascular compression of facial nerve. The data of patient presented with hemifacial spasm and blepharospasm from 2017 to 2019 was analyzed, and history of hypertension, stress, and relationship of preaching with anxiety, bright light was obtained. MRI brain findings were analyzed for neurovascular conflict, and based on MRI finding, patients were categorized into Chavda grading, and indentation of facial nerve was noted. ICA loop is graded by Chavda into the following grades. The grade 1 is when the ICA loop borders the internal auditory canal. Grade 2 is when the loop insinuates itself in the canal but occupies 50% or less of the canal. And grade 3 is when the loop occupies more than 50% of the canal. Inclusion criteria were patient with hemifacial spasm and blepharospasm who underwent MRI brain. And exclusion criteria were patient with facial tics, dystonia, hemimasticatory spasm, tardive dyskinesia, other form of facial and oromandibular dystonic movements. And we found that the mean age of the patients was 49 years, and out of 15 patients, 2 had blepharospasm and 13 had hemifacial spasm. 9 of them had proximal compression of facial nerve, 5 had distal, and 1 had combined compression of facial nerve. 9% of the patient had combined compression of facial nerve, and 33% of the patient had distal, and 60% had proximal compression of the facial nerve. 8 of the patients have facial nerve indentation, and 7 had no facial nerve indentation. And there was no relationship of severity of symptoms noted by patient with indentation of facial nerve. And among the proximal compression of facial nerve, 90% had grade 1 Chavda ICA loop. MRI showing Chavda grade 1. The red arrow is showing the 7th nerve, and the blue arrow is showing the 8th nerve, and yellow is showing the ICA. This is Chavda grade 2. Red is showing the 7th, 8th is showing, blue is showing the 8th, yellow is showing the ICA, and gray is showing the internal aortic canal. This is distal neurovascular conflict. Red is showing the 7th and 8th nerve complex, and blue is showing the vertebral artery present, causing the indentation of the nerve. And we found that blepharospasm, there was only proximal compression in cases of blepharospasm, whereas all the 3 compressions were present in cases of hemifacial spasm. The prevalence of hemifacial spasm is 9.8 per 1 lakh person. And in our study, the mean age of the patient was 49 years, which was comparable to other studies. And there was no relationship between hemifacial spasm and hypertension. 33% of patients had distal compression of facial nerve, which was comparatively higher than the previous studies. Pathophysiology of vascular compression syndrome is not yet confirmed. One of the hypotheses is of continuous and pulsatile compression. And in our study, ICA was the most offending vessel, which is 60% of cases, which was higher than as reported by Sami M et al., which was more than 50% in their study.
Other hypotheses are impaired blood flow by the neurovascular compression may result in reduced vascular perfusion. The nuclear hypothesis, the peripheral hypothesis, sympathetic hypothesis, and the emphatic theory, which refers to the development of true short-circuit electric activity, which is the passage of neural impulse through artificial chemical or chemical synapses. For blepharospasm, the structural lesions in basal ganglia and other risk factors have been described, and most cases are of unknown etiology. The treatment for spasma, botulinum neurotoxin, microvascular decompression, and orbital myectomy when the botulinum toxin is ineffective for blepharospasm. To conclude, proximal distal double and venous compression of 7th and 8th nerve complex can be the cause of hemifacial spasm. There was no association between hemifacial spasm and hypertension, and presence of neurovascular conflict of facial nerve in blepharospasm, for which further electrophysiological studies will be useful to examine and clarify this association. And all patients presenting with hemifacial spasm or blepharospasm need to undergo imaging of facial nerve to understand the nature of neurovascular compression and the offending vessel. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Neha. Nice presentation. I wanted to know what is the approximate cost of investigations patient has to undergo to diagnose all these things.
Ma'am, MRI brain actually it do cost to the patient, but in any to rule out aneurysm also we should do a MRI brain. Plus the neurovascular conflict which is operable, the patient will be having permanent treatment to it. If a neurosurgeon gives a consent that he can go ahead with the surgery rather than taking the botulinum toxin on a 3-monthly or 6-monthly basis. If we check the cost of that plus this, compare it with the MRI, then I think there will be a fruitful treatment modality for the patient.
Yeah. One question is, how did you differentiate your blepharospasm with hemifacial spasm patient?
So first one was by history wise the patient.
What is blepharospasm? What do you mean by blepharospasm patient?
Involuntary contraction of the orbicularis oculi present bilaterally, but yes, it can present unilateral and then it can go for bilateral.
But you have taken bilateral cases as blepharospasm.
Bilateral as blepharospasm.
So how come then in bilateral case unilateral facial compression has resulted into this?
That's why further studies need to be done, and we just found the relationship.
So the standard teaching says if a patient is of essential blepharospasm, then you need not to go for MRI because the question of unilateral compression on facial nerve is gone. But in hemifacial spasm, one has to do MRI as a part of standard protocol. But here you are suggesting that in 2 of the patients of blepharospasm, you got unilateral compression, and this is the causative factor, which is beyond understanding actually.
So it can be coincidental or with no relationship also, but further studies and the more sample size is required to see whether any relationship is there.
All right. So now we move ahead to the next presentation, Dr. Mehnaz Sabha.
Yes, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Yes. Acha, hall coordinator, in front of my photo, some other name is coming every time, different names. So is it from your side or my side? I don't know.
No, sir. You can rename it.
I don't know. 3-4 names have come in front of my name. Anyway, I am doctor from your side.
Okay,
continue.
Yes, sir. Good morning, sir. Sir, today I'm going to present a paper on anterior flap opposition in external DCR, the anterior flap of nasal and mucosal flap with the help of fibrin glue. And we have compared it with the conventional technique of approximation of the anterior flap with the help of with conventional technique, that is with the sutures. There is no financial disclosure and there is no conflict of interest. This is the abstract. And the aim of my study is to evaluate the success rate of flap opposition with fibrin glue and compared with the conventional closure with the help of 6-0 Vicryl in conventional technique in external DCR. Since fibrin glue is believed to be a bioglue and it induces minimal inflammation to the tissue, and it has post-operatively, it is believed to have greater post-operative comfort. So here we have used fibrin glue in place of sutures in one of the group in our study. There is two clear goal of the DCR procedure. One has to be large bony ostium, and here we have used 15 into 15 millimeters square of bony ostium, so that the patency is maintained in both the groups. And other goal is to have a mucosal line anastomosis. And for that we need to have a smooth sealant action of the anti-mucosal flaps. So there has to be minimal fibrosis at the ostium site. So this is the prospective randomized control study. We have taken 25 patients in each group, the fibrin group and the sutures group, that is a conventional group. We have performed the common clinical history and examination, including lacrimal examination of the patients. And patient under 12 years of age, revised dactylocystorhinostomy, secondary nasolacrimal duct obstruction, and patient with chronic dactylocystitis with lacrimal fistula were excluded from our study. We have adopted a similar approach except for the anterior lacrimal and nasal mucosal flap apposition with the help of 6-0-Vicryl in control group and fibrin glue in case group. This is the photo picture showing the apposition of flap with fibrin glue. We have followed up these patients at 2 weeks, 6 weeks, and 12 weeks, and we have done fluorescein dye disappearance test, syringing, and endoscopic examination to see the ostium site at these follow-ups. Then the functional and anatomical success rate were assessed. Functional success rate were assessed by the absence of AP flora and fluorescein dye disappearance test, and anatomical success rate was assessed by syringing and endoscopic view of the ostium. The fibrosis at the ostium site was graded according to size and associated fibrous band over it on endoscopic view. Grade 0 was a well-opposed mucosal flap with no fibrosis visible. Grade 1 was thin circumferential fibrous band covering less than 20% of ostium site. Grade 2 is thick fibrous band covering 20 to 50% of osteotomy site. Grade 3 is thick fibrous band with radial folds covering more than 50% of osteotomy site. And grade 4 is either closed with fibrous tissue or cicatricial closure. Then we have assessed the outcome of these patients in the two groups. Functional success rate was 22 in suture group and was 23 in fibrin group. But in anatomical success rate, that is on syringing, we found that 23 patients was patent on syringing in suture group, as one of the patient had a physiological pump failure, and all 23 patients was patent on syringing in glued group. And 2 patients on the control group, that is suture group, had closed ostium, and only 1 patient had closed ostium in glued group, as the other patient in glued group had closed common canalicular duct because of overflow of fibrin glue it lead to reflux of fibrin glue operatively because of there was operatively there was of glue. So there was common canalicular duct.
Please conclude, madam. Madam, please conclude.
Can I request Mr. Sujit, please mute yourself.
Sorry.
Mr. Sujit, thank you. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Sorry. And then we have assessed the progression of osteotomy site scarring. Here we have seen that 2 weeks, 6 weeks, and 12 weeks, we don't have any statistically significant difference in the two group. Although number was variable, but we didn't find any significance in the progression of the scarring in these two groups. So both the groups has comparable result with respect to functional and anatomical success rate, but the limitation of our study was that we have taken only 50 patients, and more study with a further larger group, it may give a more significant value. And,
Madam, please conclude, madam.
Yes, so
All right. So nice study, Dr. Sabha. One question is that fibrin glue generally do not impart strength. So wherever we require strength in any sutured area, we do not use fibrin glue, and there are chances of flaps falling back due to lack of strength. So I think that concern will always be there, especially in sac surgery, which cannot be revised. And if flap fall back, then you will have your results compromised to a great extent. So I think this concern is always there.
Okay, sir. So we used to hold
Yes,
it.
that's a good comment by Dr. Sharma. That how really it is different, because suture is so simple, and you can have to do the cost and so many things. And really, I'm not convinced about the advantage of this. Anyway, any comment from others?
Any local reaction that you found?
No, ma'am, we didn't find any such local reaction. In both the groups, there was such no local reaction.
So what was the advantage of using fibrin glue at all, if you had? I don't, because I believe there are more of disadvantages. So why should we change the technique at all?
Ma'am, because it incite minimal inflammation, so post-operative recovery is believed to be better.
What did you find? What did you find?
Ma'am, actually, we were post-operative recovery. We didn't assess that, but ma'am,
it's okay. It's okay. Don't get answered. Good.
Dr. Mukesh, can we please wind up in next 30 seconds?
So we have had a very nice session. All the presenters, they did very nice presentations, and few of the presentations has got very high standard also. So I thank all my fellow chairs also, along with all the presenters, to have a wonderful session. So thank you.
Thank you.